6:23 coming up towards 6:24 in Trinidad and Tobago. So let's talk about the economy, because every year the World Economic Forum publishes the Global Competitiveness Index report, which assesses the competitiveness landscape of 140 participating economies, providing insight into the drivers of their productivity and prosperity, or lack thereof, as the case may be. Trinidad and Tobago ranked 89th out of 140 in the latest publication of the report. But to break down that exactly as to what that represents to us, we are joined by Dr. Balraj Kisto, lecturer and program director at the Arthur Lockjack Graduate School of Business. Doc, good to have you with us
good
this
to be
morning.
Here this morning.
And I suppose 89 out of 140, it sounds like you're failing. But before we even go further into some of those numbers, what does that represent year on year for Trinidad and Tobago?
Okay, when you look at the last 3 years, I say we was on an upward trend. So we started at 92, and when we were at 84, we went down to 92 with a little fall in the economy and so on. We are now back up to 89. In the grand scheme of things, it is constant from what we have last year. Now, the rank is but one piece of the puzzle.
That's what I was going to say, because for example, I could say that last term I finished 7th in test.
Exactly.
And the next year I finished 5th in test, but relevant percentage didn't increase. The others around me moved up and down.
And that is exactly what happened. Because what happened is that our rank stayed the same. But, you know, as you speak about the class, as you're placed in class, what is your score? What is your mark?
Yeah.
And what actually happened was that our score fell slightly. Now, generally speaking, for the last 10 years we have been doing this, our score has stayed constant at 3.9, 4.0 out of 7, which generally speaking, when you get in a passing mark, but we will go in a little further into that here. So what happened this year was that our score fell by 0.06. Now, if we were able to maintain our score of 4.0, it meant that we would have been in like an 81 or 82nd position. So relatively speaking, what happened was that our place stayed the same, but what actually happened was that those who did worse than us, basically, we stayed constant. We just didn't do as bad as everybody else. Now, that in context, our score did not change in any significant way. But this index is based on 12 pillars divided into 3 sub-indices. And so the detail really, you know, the devil is in the details. The detail.
Yeah.
And as I tell people when they ask me about this, I say, you know what? Forget the rank and the score so much. Let's look at the dimensions and each of these individuals, because the score that we see, you get a score overall. You get a score per sub-indices. You get a score per a pillar, and then you get a score per dimension.
Correct.
So you can actually go into each one and say, okay, let me see. And there are some easy wins, you know, to see.
But let's try and take it on a step-by-step basis, because I think the idea is to provide our viewers and our listeners with a clearer picture as to what exactly the situation is. I think we have a graphic that's available that we could put up for you to have a look at. Now, this is one of the bits of data. Now, if you look at that, and I'll explain it for our viewers and listeners especially, that the blue line is Trinidad and Tobago. The gray line is Latin America and the Caribbean. And it talks about those same factors that you refer to: innovation, institutions, infrastructure, macroeconomic development, higher education, labor market efficiency. And it appears, Dr. Kisto, that we are not doing too badly when it comes to Latin America and the Caribbean, because with the exception of market size, which is obvious because we're a small country, we are equal or better than the average of Latin America and the Caribbean.
Right. So what we are seeing here is what we call the web. The web now is basically a breakdown of the 12 pillars of competitiveness. So when you look at that web, it is said on us, what is our score on each of those pillars of competitiveness? Now, compared to Latin America and the Caribbean, we are on par except for market size. But bear this in mind. Part of the details that you get is that, because remember, all economies are not the same. So economies are graded based mainly on their per capita income. Now, Trinidad and Tobago has a per capita income of slightly over 21,000 US per year.
Yeah.
So because of that, we are placed in a category called the innovation-driven economy. Now, What that means is that, because remember this is a lead indicator, it is saying if you want to maintain your lifestyle and your long-term prosperity and so on, what we need to do is to take account of certain things. So we need to take our basic infrastructure, that accounts for 20% in that category. 50% is efficiency enhancers. But we also say that if you want to maintain that, you must look at your innovation factors also. Now, because of that classification and our per capita income, Trinidad and Tobago is classified with the top economies in the world. So we are the only country in Latin America and the Caribbean. And that's because of the huge difference generally in the average per capita income. So because of that, this looks good, this web looks really good when compared to Latin America and the Caribbean. But if you take the same web and you superimpose the standards of what is expected for countries in the same class, in the same innovation-driven economy, you'll see that we are only on par on macroeconomic environment and primary health, and a little bit on higher education also. So generally speaking, it is saying an economy in our stage of development, we need to get certain acts, or we need to get our act together in a number of areas.
I know this is a different discussion altogether, but as you mentioned, the per capita income, 21,000 US per
21,311.
That works out to, let's say, 135,000 TT.
Yes.
I mean, and many people, their eyes will open wide to say, I wish I was earning 135,000 TT annually. Does that suggest, and I know this is not necessarily part of our discussion this morning, that suggests that there's a very, very wide disparity between the top earners of the economy and the lowest earners in the economy?
Not necessarily. What basically the GDP per capita says is that it takes your total earnings as a country and it divides it by the number of persons in the country. Now, one of the classical weakness of that measure is that assumes equal distribution.
That's what I'm saying. That's why I'm asking about, the whole issue of equity and distribution.
Right. Now, if you go into a little more economics, they'll talk about what you call Pareto efficiency and all this thing, which measures the distribution of income. For that reason, what we have seen now, because generally speaking, and for a long time, that has been used as a measure of standard of living. And we realize it is flawed because, as you say, there's wide income disparity. So now the UN doesn't use that anymore.
Right.
But what it is saying, as a country, we are earning a certain per capita per person. How it's distributed in the country, that's that's governmental and so on. But they say that we are earning.
All right. Let's look at some of those as that have been identified, the most problematic factors for doing business. And I know this would have been talked about at the presentation and so on. Poor work ethic in the labor force, corruption, inefficient government and bureaucracy, crime and theft, access to financing, the top five. How do those numbers compare again on a year-on-year basis?
Okay. First, let me explain how we get this piece of information.
Sure.
Well, this survey is a survey that is done where you survey decision makers, board of directors, managers, and so on. And we usually do at least 150 persons or so. Now, one of the question 5 of that survey asks the question, what do you see? Rank the top 5 problematic factors for doing business in your country. The thing about this is that when I did the presentation on Wednesday, I did a 10-year span, 2005, 2010, and 2015. And what we have seen is that the top 5 has not changed. What happened on a year-on basis is that last year, government bureaucracy was seen as the top problem. This year, work ethic has been the top problem. In short, the same problems has been identified as a chronic problem throughout the throughout the time that we have been doing this. Now, interestingly, when we talk about poor work ethic here, this is mainly done in the private sector.
Yeah.
So it's not to say we are speaking about
the public sector.
The public sector here.
Yes.
So it for me that's a more deep-rooted problem that need to be tackled in a different way. But this problem has not changed. And if you realize the other two is, one is white collar crime and the other is blue collar crime.
Exactly. So the problems essentially remain the same. One other question in relation to this, Dr. Kisto. How reliable would be data provided by the business sector? Because they're going to have one particular point of view.
Yes. Well, the thing about it is that we have seen the same thing happen over the period. But bear in mind, this is taking the perspective of people who we think knows what is happening because remember, this is looking at business as from a very capitalistic market.
Correct. You know, they as far as they're concerned,
yes.
To hell with equity and whatever, they just want profit.
Well, actually, there's 133 dimensions in this, and more than 33 or 35 is really based on hard data also. Right. So that kind of, and then it doesn't only look at, from say the profit side, but it look at labor relations, it look at the macroeconomy, it looks at higher education and learning and stuff. So it doesn't only take into account the opinion on the economy and so on alone. But yes, that is because when you look at part of the problem with work ethic could be sometime, the infrastructure, traffic, people having to take care of their kids, single mothers, and all these things would have a mitigated.
Could be low wages.
Yeah.
I mean, you wouldn't get the business community to say, well, we're really not paying people a proper wage.
And we have a thing in management, we say that people don't leave companies, they leave managers.
Yes.
So it goes on both sides. But you hear the constant story all the time, and I think overall, that alone, says one thing. But when you look at pillar 1 of the index, which is institutions,
yes,
some of these things seem to be institutionalized rather than anything. Now, this for me, as I said, is a ground zero as far as competitiveness is concerned, because you can have all the money, which is the fuel into the system, but if the system itself is not working properly, then the efficiency, level of efficiency, the leakage that would take place and so on is a problem. And this for me is one of the more fundamental
problems. Well, but let's talk about that,
yes.
because we're breaking down the numbers for you, and we have Dr. Kisto to give some context. So let's go to that first pillar, institutions. If you look at our ranking on the issue of favoritism in decisions of government officials, perceptions.
Yeah.
137 out of 140.
Yes, that is really bad.
Business costs of crime and violence, 136 out of 140.
And that is the perception of people out there. Now, the thing about this is that this pillar, over the last 3 years, the way I say it's worrying, has gotten progressively, albeit incrementally, worse. So, and if you look at overall, our score is 4.0.
Yeah.
But this score is 3.3 or 3.4, which means that is below the average. And this is really, if your systems aren't working properly, your institutions aren't working properly, then everything else would follow. And as I said, this is not some of the centuries we want to be scoring here.
Exactly. I mean, you're right. I mean, you don't want to get big numbers in this particular sort of study. But from your perspective, Dr. Kisto, and in the few minutes that we have left, I think this is really the important issue. Does this data really inform policy? Does it inform from your own experience?
Yes.
Because there are political imperatives, there are economic imperatives, there are many different pullers and drivers of the economy and so on. From your own experience, does this sort of data actually inform policy either in the public sector or the private sector?
Well, the previous government under Minister Tiwari, he had established the National Council for Competitiveness and Innovation. And one of the goals they had in their macroeconomic framework was to improve competitiveness by 20 spaces.
Yes.
Now, that is what they say is an end goal. A few years ago, I sat in a committee with the Ministry of Tourism, because this is one of the index that comes out. There's also what you call the Travel and Tourism Index. And we actually went through this piece by piece and say, okay, let's see some low-hanging fruit there. On Wednesday, when this was launched, the Minister of Planning gave the address. And one of the points I made was that our data is not up to date. We do have reliable data because of CSO.
Yes.
And she gave the assurance that CSO would be updated and so on. So from that perspective, people take cognizance of it. To what extent now it gets lost in the wilderness is another issue. But if it is something out there that we pay attention to.
And we do have the report, as we mentioned, that we're talking about. And one of the areas where we seem to score pretty well, if we look at the 5th pillar, higher education and training,
yes,
we have 5 different categories in which we're in the top 50.
Right, and that means that we have a lot of what you call competitive advantages there. The thing about that, however, is that because the data, they would not take the data from us because there's a sort of bias. So they would go to places like UNESCO, the World Bank, and so on. Because our data have not been updated consistently there, these results could even be better.
So, and that is important to understand before we conclude, and you know, how reliable is the information, because at the end of the day, I suppose the average citizen or the business person or someone looking to get some guidance from this might be asking themselves, should I be worried? Should I say, well, you know, this data is reliable, or I can't rely on this data? What is your perspective as to the reliability of
in terms of the data? Because remember, there's hard data and opinion data.
Yes.
The hard data is reliable because we get it from authentic, independent, international sources. So the data is reliable. The other thing is this is supposed to be a lead indicator. So it's really given an expert opinion on certain things. The reliability comes from, because it is done year round, we never survey the same population and so on. We have done this over election period, over normal period, boost, boom
and bust, whatever it is,
and the result has been consistent over a period of time.
Does that suggest that it's very difficult to effect fundamental transformation of the economy?
Yeah, I think because part of doing that transformation would require some hard, tough decisions, and sometimes, sadly, there's not the political will to take some of those decisions. Hopefully, we will see that going forward.
And very quickly, because we have just about a minute left, do you think that our difficult economic times that appear to be ahead, and everybody seems to be projecting towards that, talking about a 1986 sort of scenario, is that the right sort of environment for a government that has just come into office to possibly contemplate some of those measures?
Yes, because remember, the basis of competitiveness is productivity. So if you can get more output with what the little input that you have, then you're much better off. And this is pointing to where you need to plug the holes, where are some of the inefficiencies, what are some of the things you need to do so that you can get more out of the little resources that you have. Dr.
Balaraj Kisto, thanks very much for joining us this morning to give us some context to this Global Competitiveness Report from the World Economic Forum, data that we should at least be informed about as far as our policymakers to understand where we are at in Trinidad and Tobago. And really, we haven't changed all that much, better or worse, but we just seem to be flatlining in many respects as far as the growth or the lack of growth in our economy. When we come back, we'll talk about something very different. We'll move to the issue of mediation after the break.